Welcome everyone to this webinar to launch our research project called Governance of Impact, Can European Foundations Rise to the Challenge? My name is Lisa Hemberger and I'm the director of the Esade Center for Social Impact. And I wanted to also mention the 4 foundations that have funded the research, Bertelsmann Stiftung, Nina Carasso Foundation, Laudes Foundation, and the Baudouin Foundation. So thank you very much to the 4 foundations for your support of the project. And this is the agenda of the day, of the webinar. So we'll start with an introduction to the research. And then I'll hand over to Nina Buckland, who will present the key research findings. Then we'll have a panel discussion and also Q&A at the very end. So in terms of housekeeping, if you have any technical problems, you can send an email to Domenica Diaz, or you can also use the Zoom chat function to mention any problems that you have. And would like you to post any questions during the webinar in the Zoom Q&A function, and then we'll address them as well as we can towards the end of the webinar. So please feel free to post any questions during the webinar there. So this paper has been co-authored between actually 4 people. So Nina Buckland, who will be presenting, is the main author of the paper, and she is the senior researcher at the Esade Center for Social Impact. The other researchers are Cristina Osoro and Valentin Held, who have been fundamental to actually putting this together. So thank you for your contribution, as well as to Laura Reinders, who has been a fundamental part of the team as well. And I'm very, very happy to have such a wonderful panel that I will introduce in more detail later on. But we have today in the panel Wilfried Uhr, who's the Senior Vice President of Bertelsmann Stiftung. We also have Deirdre Mortel with us, who's CEO of Rethink Ireland, as well as Brioc van Dam, who's the CEO of the Baudouin Foundation. So you'll hear from them in a bit. And so I'll start by introducing the research, and I wanted to say just a few words about the Esade Center for Social Impact. So we are a research center housed within the Esade Business School in Barcelona, and we work on research that has rigor, reach, and relevance about and for social impact. We work on 3 main research areas, so impact investing and actually philanthropy, impact entrepreneurship, and also impact measurement and management. This research project actually comes out of a larger project that we have been working on now for more than 3 years. It's a community of practice of foundations. So we created 2 communities of practice, one at a European level, and you can see on the right-hand side here, all the foundations that participated across Europe. So it's been a wonderful community. We also had a Spanish community, so a number of Spanish foundations that came together. And this was all facilitated by the support from BBK, which is a foundation based in Bilbao in Spain. And what came out of these discussions, so we were talking about impact measurement and management, and I'll mention as well a little bit about definitions, how we see that. So first of all, impact, it's about the effects experienced by people or the planet as a result of one or more activities. And of course, the measurement part is how you actually understand that impact. So what kind of methods and approaches do we use to have a better understanding of impact? What we find is very important is actually the management part. So how do you integrate impact into the systems, the processes, the culture and capabilities of an organization, so that you can actually more actively manage and optimize your impact? So how can you have a deeper and greater impact if you're a mission-driven organization? So this is really what the community of practice was about. We were trying to help foundations become better at both impact measurement and management, and also identify some of the pain points, some of the challenges that foundations were having. And one of the things that emerged from working with the community of practice for several years was this idea of governance. So the way we see governance is really about the systems and processes by which organizations are directed, controlled, and held accountable. And that means that they're really kind of two functions. So one is more strategic, so providing direction for the organization, for the foundation in this case, as well as a control function. So how do you monitor and ensure accountability? And what we found really when working with these foundations was that, first of all, there wasn't a lot of research done on the topic. Okay, so we looked at a lot of different practitioner reports, and we couldn't really find a lot of good answers there. And also that governance was not really working to optimize impact in the foundations that were participating in the community of practice. So we found that actually not a lot of foundations felt that they had boards that understood what impact meant and had enough knowledge and enough information to make decisions based on impact data. And we also felt that it wasn't just about the boards, but actually governance goes across the entire organization, across the entire foundation. So it's really about also understanding the governance of impact beyond just boards, but actually how are you integrating impact in decision-making in foundations. And what we try to contribute now with this research, and we are very excited to launch the results now, is really to redefine what governance is about. So governance, expanding governance from thinking more about financials, but also including impact, but also expanding it from just thinking about boards, but actually thinking about responsibilities across foundations. So we want to also provide material that helps foundations have this discussion internally, with their boards, but also across the foundation. So what we try to develop is this kind of multi-layered perspective across the foundations that included a variety of stakeholders, so board members, but also the CEOs, the senior management teams, the staff, and also the grantees. So we wanted to have those different perspectives, and we had amazing access to 6 foundations. I'll just, in the next slide, explain who they are. But we also wanted to provide some sort of practical ideas and practical frameworks for foundations so that they could actually be helped, to understand how they could improve the governance of impact. And of course, since we are a research center, we're also conducting academic research, and we would like to publish academic studies based on this data collection and really use philanthropy as a research setting, which is actually quite underexplored in academia. In terms of methodology, as I mentioned, we worked with the 4 foundations that were funding the project that I already mentioned. But we also had the privilege of getting access to 2 additional foundations, so Rethink Ireland and Pontis Foundation. All of these foundations were part of our community of practice, and I think it really helped that we knew the foundations very well already, before we embarked on this specific research project. And we have been conducting interviews with over 60 representatives of these 6 foundations. And we also had access to a lot of other documentation that helped us understand better this topic of governance of impact. We also organized, once we had our first findings, we organized 3 workshops with board members, CEOs, and senior management team from the participating foundations, where we actually presented the ideas across the 6 foundations at those different levels, and had additional feedback that we incorporated into our research. And we also had an amazing advisory committee, so I'd like to thank them as well, that helped us advance and interpret our findings. First, we had Bonnie Chu, who's an expert on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and helped us really put that perspective deeply into our findings. We also have Kevin Bolduc, who is working at the Center for Effective Philanthropy in the US, and also Ruth Aguilera, who's a professor at Northeastern and a worldwide expert on corporate governance. So I'd like to thank everyone who has contributed to this research, and now hand over to my colleague, Leonora.
Thanks so much, Lisa. So I'm sure that you're all really keen to hear from the panel. So we will try and make the findings part sort of brief, but enough to give you a bit of an idea of what is in our report. Just to let you know that we have an executive summary, which we're going to send to you, everyone who's registered for the launch. We'll send to you tomorrow. And then the full report we're going to launch in a few weeks. So the executive summary has a good deal of all the findings, but it's the full report where you can sort of see all of the detail and the case studies. So just to talk about the findings, the first thing that we really tried to do was to look at, what do we mean by governance of impact? What's included? How can we understand it? So we created a thematic framework to help us sort of unpack this whole idea of how do you govern impact within an organization. In this case, we're looking at foundations, obviously, and we have three themes that we sort of unpacked. The first one, which is on this slide, is the people and culture theme. The second one is the knowledge and information flows, and the third one is the structure and processes. So people and culture, what do we mean by this? Well, it's pretty obvious when you talk about governance that one of the most important things is, who sits on the board, how do you decide who sits on the board, and how does the board members interact with the senior management team and the rest of the organization. So that's quite commonly understood as a big driver of governance. But what we also tried to look at was some of the maybe more subtler elements of what's going on, particularly in the foundation world when it comes to people and culture, because actually what we found was there can be people coming from quite different backgrounds who are sort of put together to try and drive forward the missions and drive forward impact. And you can have people either from the public sector, or they could be from the NGO philanthropic world, or from the private sector. And actually there can be what we've called here under some of the key elements, there can be some quite sort of significant mindset tensions. And this really plays out quite a lot in the impact arena. So the key elements of people and culture, as I mentioned, was sort of who sits on the board, the relationship between the SMT CEO and the board. Some CEOs manage to nurture a very good relationship with the chair, and that really helps some of the governance issues. There are organizational dynamics, for example, how long is the culture, has the organization been around? Is there a flat hierarchy, or is it quite hierarchical? Because that can all affect things like the information flows and how the governance works. The mindset tensions, which I just mentioned, between sort of more philanthropic type of background and a business background. And quite a lot of boards have quite a strong influence from the kind of private sector. And sometimes that can be a little bit tricky. And then also this whole area of diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of, who has a seat around the table when it comes to these really critical decisions about, the strategy of the foundation, how it's going to spend its money, etc. So the two challenges we identified related to this theme were really to do with kind of language, which sounds quite basic, but actually one of the questions that we asked in our interviews was, how do you understand impact? What does that mean to you? And we got nearly 60 different responses, not quite, but it just showed that actually people have quite a distinct way of understanding impact, and that can cause and amplify some of these sort of mindset tensions. And the second challenge, which we knew very much coming into the research was a very big one, is really how do we get these high performing boards who feel really confident and engaged, how can they become strategic allies to us? And we sort of saw this dynamic where sometimes board members feel either they don't have the right information, or they have reams of impact evaluation reports, which they find incredibly boring and they don't want to go through. So it's sort of somehow that it's not working to get that right balance. And when it does work, and when the board is that sort of strategic partner, it can be very enriching, and obviously very important for the mission. Thanks. So now we'll talk a little bit about the knowledge and information flows. And so this is really important in terms of the evidence with which the board, but also the senior management team, people who are running the projects and the programs, are making decisions with. So what is the quality of that evidence? And very much important here to stress that a lot of this is about learning. So how can the foundation, the philanthropic sector, really become more learning organizations and use this incredible richness of on the ground data, information exchange that they have all the time, and how can that flow upwards to these sort of more like governance organs and decision-making bodies. So we look at things like reporting, we look at how information flows across the foundation, up in the foundation, but then also, as we have under here, the key elements, that the resources, we do find that those foundations which have prioritized, time and have really got proper budgets for impact measurement and management, sometimes, these flows happen better, just because of the resourcing. So the sort of challenges here are really about optimizing these information flows, which depends really on the structure of the foundation. Sometimes you have quite siloed programmatic areas, and it can be quite difficult to get those flows working. And then the other challenge is particularly the case for larger foundations, or foundations that are working on many different issues, is how can we get a kind of some overarching impact narrative or sense of how we're doing, what we're doing, how we're performing against our mission, particularly if we have lots of different issue areas. And that's quite a sort of thorny challenge for many foundations, particularly the larger ones. Okay, thank you. So the final theme that we unpack quite a lot in the research is around the structures and processes, and this is obviously a little bit more what you might think of when you think of governance, in terms of what are the governing organs of the philanthropies, how are decisions made, and are there proper processes to support learning, or to support what we might call kind of accountability. And actually what we found here is that although that sometimes this is in quite a lot of flux in philanthropy, that where the decisions sit can shift and change. So the sort of governing organs might be the same, but there may not actually be a really clear sense of who's actually responsible, for example, for the strategy of the foundation, which has a lot related to impact. How are those decisions made at different levels? So just merely kind of mapping these things out can be quite helpful. So the challenges here we uncovered were a little bit related to stakeholder voice. So some foundations have quite organic structures, decision-making structures. They get a lot of outside experts, people involved when they make decisions, for example, of related to which projects to fund, how to go about doing those projects, etc. So we have examples here. For example, King Baudouin Foundation, who has over 4,000 volunteer experts making these kinds of decisions. And other foundations, maybe they don't have so much of that sort of stakeholder voice. It's obviously something that we want to encourage. And actually there's a whole research field around participative governance and what we might call democratic accountability. which is developing, and I think is really important. And then the final challenge, which perhaps relates much more to those working in systems field that are trying to create systems change, longer term impact. There's quite a challenge of just the fact that it's sometimes really hard to understand and assess your impact, to provide that short-term data and evidence that perhaps the governing bodies and people, particularly board, would like to see to understand what's happening. So that can be a challenge. So those are the challenges and the themes that we developed. And here's just a very brief slide to show across different foundations. In fact, all these challenges are quite common. The foundations that we spoke to are very different. They have different profiles, corporate versus family versus public. Some are fundraising, some are sitting on large endowments. So they're very different, but actually some of these challenges related to governance impact, we felt that they were common across them all. So which were the leading hardest challenges? I think the ones related to people and culture came up as perhaps the most significant ones. So the developing of the common language and the working with the board to get their kind of confidence really up. That's where, you know, it was a high challenge for quite a few foundations. But we go more into this into the research, so I'll leave it there. So what we'd like to do before exploring a little bit more what we think might help create better governance of impact, we just wanted to do a little Zoom poll to find out what might be the biggest challenges for you, but also where you come from, you know, whether you come from a foundation or another organization. So we'll just run a Zoom poll now, and you'll be able to vote on that. Would be really, I think, interesting for the group. You should see the poll pop up on your screen now. So if you could just complete that. So there are three questions there, and then we'll share the results. So Domenica, I'll leave it to you to tell me when you feel we've got something to share.
We can continue with the presentation and then.
Yeah, okay, well, let's do that. Yeah, so keep voting, everyone. So we have a good sample for the Zoom poll, and that will help also the panel. So just to go into, and I said, obviously, the research wasn't just based on, you know, what do we mean by governance of impact? What are the challenges? We wanted to share something that we hope can be helpful for the field. And so what we've done is we've created what we think is sort of a group of what we call levers, which can help you as an organization to improve your governance of impact. And in the report, we actually have a kind of a self-diagnosis tool. So it's a table for each of these levers, which will help you work out where you are. Are you a beginner, or are you sort of in the middle of the road, or are you advanced on it? So it's and we also have a lot of case studies to help you think, well, if I wanted to work on this particular lever, what might I do? So that's just to say that this whole framework is much more developed in the report, but I'll just introduce it very briefly. And really it builds on and relates to everything that I've said before about the challenges and unpacking what's going on. So the first lever is related to building this common language and understanding of impact, particularly navigating the different mindsets, which I explained to you, which could be the philanthropic sort of non-profit mindset versus a more business private sector mindset. And the second one is fostering a board that champions and discusses impact. And I think the discussing impact is really important, because actually what we found is that sometimes at board level, even though impact is, you know, really, really important, clearly for mission-driven organizations, there isn't that much space to discuss it, or there can be a lot of presentations of activities which can be, not conducive to really a proper deep discussion. And the third, we obviously feel very strongly about the need to embed a diversity and inclusion lens and offer different ways that foundations are going about doing that. Part of that is really also just gathering data, really understanding, getting that sort of disaggregated data that you need to make better decisions. And on the knowledge and information flows, we talk about improving translation mechanisms. And by that, we mean all that amazing information and knowledge that resides in the foundations, particularly at the project level. How can that be translated to really inspire and enrich some of those governance level conversations? We talk about investing in capacity building internally related to impact measurement and management, because obviously the more knowledge and skills reside within the foundation, and it's quite a fast moving field, the more confident people will be to sort of gather the right evidence. And number 6 is about building the impact narrative, which we spoke about can be quite a challenge. And then on the structures and processes, we really feel that a lot of it is about sort of mapping out what's going on, where are the decisions, and ensuring that the board and everyone has that clear understanding of what their role and responsibility is versus others, and then finally sort of integrating the stakeholder voice. So those are the kind of 9 levers. I'll just very briefly talk to a few ones now, but there's a lot more detail in the report, so please do use that, as I'm only giving a tiny tips here. But in terms of this, the common language, we've got Deirdre from Rethink Ireland here, and I think one of the clever things that they've done is to create quite a simple but also really helpful tool which shows what they understand as the different levels of impact that they are having. And I'm sure Deirdre can articulate this much better than I can, but they're a foundation that works with many social entrepreneurs in Ireland. So they have an impact on what they call the awardees, which would be the social entrepreneurs in Ireland. And those awardees would have an impact on their beneficiaries. So that's sort of the second level. And then they also finally have an impact on the ecosystem. So they're sort of breaking down these different impacts. They have a definition for those impacts, and then they have a tool to assess those impacts in their organization. So that's M&E is monitoring and evaluation. So they've thought quite carefully about a sort of a simple but very sort of powerful approach, which makes the whole organization understand, well, what is the impact we're having and how can we measure that? Okay, so that's the first lever. I'm just picking a few levers that we have out of the 9 that we've mentioned. And this is the fourth lever, which is about what we're calling translation mechanisms. And one of the things that you come across a lot, and anyone who works with boards will know this, is the desire for like a more synthesized way of understanding and assessing impact performance of the foundation. And that can be a bit of a tension because some of the programmatic staff feel like that's too simplified. Maybe they can't get that sort of aggregate data or a kind of impact dashboard. So what King Baudouin Foundation has done is actually to create a way of a kind of a dashboard. It's not an impact dashboard in the way that we might understand impact, but it is a way of looking at the performance of the foundation. And I won't go into all of the different elements because I don't have time. It is in the report, but I think it's quite a clever way of saying, well, if we can't aggregate all the different projects and programs that we do, what is the way at board level that we can feel that we are got our fingers on the pulse in terms of some key performance indicators for the foundation. and in terms of an impact narrative, that's another sort of interesting way that you know, people are being a bit creative. Foundations are being creative about the fact that sometimes it's not possible just to kind of aggregate impact data from the different work that they're doing, and actually maybe it's not that meaningful to come up with those sort of aggregate numbers, but rather what's more meaningful is to kind of follow a storytelling approach, which I know has become very popular in the nonprofit and NGO world, and I think is very powerful as well for foundations. And Danielle and Nina Carasso is doing a very significant, bold and long-term exercise with many different stakeholders to try and develop this kind of overarching impact narrative for the foundation. And then finally, we just wanted to speak a little bit about, you know, the sort of governance of impact processes, what can support better decision making, what can create perhaps a little bit more consistency in terms of decision making. And here we have an example from Bertelsmann Stiftung, which recently has put in place a much more sort of consistent project application process, so that each of the new projects will go through you know, a similar process, a very sort of deep way of looking and reflecting at each of these projects and getting different people involved from the foundations to review and assess, to present. So to have a kind of a way of thinking about, you know, impact, but embedding that within the project application process, which is obviously something that people pay a lot of attention to because it's all about money and where does the money flow. So it's also an opportunity there to do something. So I've just given a few little highlights from the levers, but there's a lot more in the report. And what we're really hoping is that this research can offer a way in to start this internal discussion. Sometimes it can be sort of quite scary, and it's almost a bit of a sort of a sensitive and even very tricky subject around boards and governance. But maybe seeing that a lot of foundations are struggling with certain challenges and some of the ideas that come up, we just hope that it can be helpful internally for you and your foundation to use to support some of the work. And here we have the poll results, which shows that we are mostly philanthropy professionals, that the majority feel that governance of impact is a major challenge, so 58%, and 94% are saying it's a major or a moderate challenge, and the most information flows is a big challenge. Common language is a big challenge. I think I'll leave it there. You can see that yourself. So thank you very much. And yeah, now it's time for the panel.
So I already introduced our panel, and you can see, you know, who's on the panel here. I'll stop sharing now so that we can actually see the panelists, which is probably nicer. And it's really nice to be with the three of you and hear from you directly. And so I wanted to start with Deirdre. I've known you for many years actually, and also when you were you know, working at the One Foundation, which is a completely different type of foundation, and now you have set up Rethink Ireland, of course, with sort of a fundraising function. So you also have to think about governance in a different way. But can you say something about how you have approached governance of impact, also keeping in mind what you have learned from your previous experience?
Yeah, thank you so much. So it was a very different challenge, designing governance of impact in Rethink Ireland, which is a fundraising foundation, from the One Foundation, which was a family foundation. And I guess you know, so if I think about the drivers in a family foundation, you're thinking about, okay, what does impact mean to us, and what do our key stakeholders want to know in order to make good decisions over time, whether it's about grant selection or whether it's about grant renewal, or just knowing what happened in the end. Did we get value for money? And so really those decisions are quite personal, and they're as data-driven, soft or hard data, as the stakeholders want them to be. And we were doing small numbers of large grants. So small numbers of data could take us a long way in decision making. In contrast with Rethink Ireland, we're raising funds from all different kinds of donors, and also in many cases matched by government. So we're doing larger numbers of smaller grants. And so we need a lot more data. So we have to have much better data gathering systems. We need to have much better systems of sense making about that data. And we have to be much more thoughtful about who sees what data, because there's a lot of it. We don't want to waste time. And so we came up with the 3 levels of impact that Leonora referred to earlier as a guide to us in terms of what kind of data matters at what stage. So quite really very different approaches. And I guess the final thing I would mention is, when you have government funds, transparency is huge. And so a very core decision we made right from the very beginning is that we would publish our impact data, in whatever way made sense, based on how much we had and what it was saying. And we publish that on an ongoing basis, not just once a year. So on our website, you'll see that consistently updated over time.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn to Wilfried. And you have been at Bertelsmann Stiftung for many years, more than 20 years, I think. So you really have seen sort of the evolution of like how you think about impact, how you measure impact. Can you say something about that?
Yes, thank you.
Also considering that your foundation is quite different as well from what Deirdre has described.
Yes, we are not a fundraising foundation. We get our money from the Bertelsmann SE. This is the company who was founded by Reinhard Mohn, and he himself founded also the Bertelsmann Stiftung. And this is for us, or for me, it's important to explain a little bit that we are not a grant-making foundation. We are an operational foundation. It means we design and execute our projects on our own. And that's just for your understanding when I talk now about the process of impact thinking in the Bertelsmann Stiftung. The discussion in the foundation started very early, and it started from the bottom up. It was not something that came from the board. It came out of the projects itself. And in the first time we had this thinking, this impact thinking on an operational base on the project level. It was in the beginning a more or less input-output discussion. And the indicators were how many publications could be counted. For example, press releases, books, brochures, and so on. After this, we had also the question of the supervisory board, if our money is spent well. And therefore, what we did is we came up with an additional evaluation from external auditors regarding our projects. This was the next step, but they were very expensive and they did not meet the target of impact measurement, which were in the mindset of the board of trustees. They thought very differently about this. And then we came up with a big step, and Leonora explained a little bit our process regarding the application process for our projects when we embedded the IOI methodology. And this was a compulsory step in the process where the impact goals we have had to be defined by the different project managers and their staff. And what we also did, additionally, 4 staff members were sent out to gain competences regarding evaluation and impact. They studied a master program in Switzerland, in Bern. And they helped a lot the organization in this impact thinking process itself. 6 years ago, the foundation, 6 years ago, the foundation implemented a position for impact management and measurement. That was also the next big step. And this position became more and more important, and it is on its way to a strategic function now. And the next steps for this function is now to help to improve the governance of impact over all the decision levels within the foundation. In short terms, I can say we came from operational impact management on a project level to strategic impact management, not quite there yet, to be honest.
Thank you, and I think it reflects, a challenge that many foundations have, in the sense that many foundations are quite good at measuring impact at project level, but then actually aggregating or translating that information upwards and being able to have a meaningful discussion at board level, that is really a challenge. And I think it's especially a challenge for foundations that have a diversity of projects and programs, so it might be easier if you have, a more common mission that is somehow that everyone is doing more or less the same thing. And I think, in terms of similarities between foundation, the King Baudouin Foundation is, has some similarities with Bertelsmann Foundation in terms of, the size, of the budget, but also in terms of diversity of a lot of different projects that are managed. And I know that, Ryuk, you're quite new to King Baudouin Foundation, and, we had a very interesting discussion last year when you had just joined, and you were, explaining to me, what you were finding and the things that you wanted to change and so on. Can you say something about the process that you have gone through now since you started?
Hi, Lisa. Indeed, I joined the KBF 18 months ago, and I thought I knew the King Baudouin Foundation, which is quite an institution in Belgium, but actually it's a very complex animal, and I only got to understand all the complexities when I went through the onboarding process in the first couple of months of me joining. And the foundation actually has 2 missions. On the one hand, it's to encourage and facilitate philanthropy, make sure that more private means are funneled to public causes, the general interest. And the second one is to be an actor of change, and for the first part of our mission, encouraging philanthropy, they're quite straightforward key performance indicators, right? How much more money do we receive? How much more money are we able to spend in terms of thoughtful grants and projects and whatnot? For the second, being an actor of change, trying to assess that is way more complex, obviously, because we do all types of different projects. We do advocacy, we do grant making, we are also a bit of an operational foundations ourselves, we do research. And so I think, as is the case in many foundations, and I think Wilfried hinted upon that, is that the evidence is partial and very much based on projects or sub-programs. So an aggregation of a couple of projects that sort of try to achieve the same or similar goals. And of course, in terms to see how well performing the foundation, King Baudouin Foundation is, we need both. We need to see, are we indeed able to encourage philanthropy better, but also what is our impact of the money that we receive. And for that, especially also with new insights, scientific insights, new tools available. Of course, the whole evolution of data and AI, I think showed an opportunity to try new things, and that's why we started this process of trying to identify or classify different types of projects and initiatives that we fund or that we do ourselves, and see when is it appropriate to collect what type of data in order to do that impact measurement, and then also assess it. And so we're in the process of indeed having sort of a decision tree made that can help us guide when it is indeed relevant to capture what type of data and for what purpose. That's one. Second, of course, in order to do so, you need to invest in capacity, and that's also one of the recommendations of the report. So we did indeed invest in our data science cell at the foundation, and in some other functions that are key in capturing that data and integrating it into our daily work. Thirdly, and this is something that we are in the process of discussing, so I hope I will receive a mandate from my board in December, but we have the ambition to create a knowledge and impact center in order to centralize all that knowledge and make sure that we use it in a more streamlined way on all levels of the foundation, and are also able to not only communicate to our stakeholders and board, but also have sort of a waterfall effect or a spillover effect to other non-governmental partners in Belgium that may potentially be inspired or learn from what we're doing at the foundation, being the biggest philanthropic player in our country. So those are three initiatives we took based on my assessment of how the performance of the foundation is being assessed by my board.
That's really encouraging, and I think since we started the research project, we have seen a lot of changes happening, in all of the foundations actually. So which sort of made our research project more complex because we were sort of researching a moving target. But I also think that it's very encouraging to see that all foundations have really taken this really seriously, and hopefully the research itself can also be something that you can use when you're discussing this with your boards, as a sort of evidence that this is something that other foundations are working on as well. So maybe I'll return now to Wilfried, and you mentioned already some of your challenges, and that you are now working on sort of making this very, very much more strategic in the foundation, and also the importance of capacity and how you have created a function and so forth. Is there something in terms of a specific lever that we identified in the research that you're now prioritizing as next steps?
Yes, Lisa, first I have to thank you very much because there are a lot of things we can use now in our next steps for the impact governance. The two most important levers we identified for now, I must say, is first this common language. I mean, this is a huge problem because the different levels, decision-making levels, they have a totally different understanding sometimes of impact, even impact in the social society. And they most come from the industry, and they have a mindset that they have a special view of impact that consists mainly out of KPI thinking in an investing and return business. And the main question seems for us, how can we explain the impact thinking in the civil society environment to them? How can we translate this and even sometimes try to compare what they were thinking about impact in their environment and how we try to explain the impact in our environment. And I think this is one of the first steps we have to do. And the other step is the second lever, to search for an overall impact narrative. Considering, it was already said, the diversity and complexity of our program and projects, this is essential because it allows the foundation to showcase its collective impact while respecting the diversity and complexity of our programs and projects. And in summary, both of these levers are important for us, for the Bertelsmann Stiftung, as they address the need for clear communication and strategic alignment in the context of a diverse set of programs and stakeholders. And yeah, we hope we can get some more help from your side regarding these issues we are facing now.
Yeah. No, and I think what's been very nice about this project as well is that you know, some of the examples that other foundations have implemented have been inspirational, you know, to the other foundations that are part of the group, you know. So I'm always thinking about, oh well, maybe you should look at what Laudes Foundation is doing, or you know, you should look at what Rethink Ireland is doing, and you know, just mentioning a few. And I think if you look at the research report, you can find examples and case studies featuring all of the foundations that have been participating. So that has been, you know, as well a really nice part of the project. I wanted to turn to the actual board composition and the engagement with the board. And Wilfried, you mentioned that, and this is something that we found, that often in the boards of foundations, there are people who come from business backgrounds, or you know, who are lawyers, who are bankers, and might not necessarily have a lot of experience dealing with impact or discussing impact, and normally come with this sort of business mindset of KPIs and wanting to have numbers and so forth. So that is definitely a challenge that we've seen across. Of course, you know, numbers are needed, you know, so it's also sort of the challenge of like, what do you put into numbers and what don't you? But I wanted to ask Deirdre about your board and how you have actually worked with your board in terms of sort of teaching them maybe or engaging them more in an impact discussion.
Yeah, so thinking about this, we like to think about the impact conversations we have with our board as starting here and moving up the knowledge scale in a straight line. And my experience is that's not how it works. It's how we wish it would work, but it's not reality. So why is it not reality? Well, for us, it's not reality because we are a fundraising foundation, and our board terms are quite short. They're 3 years renewable, maximum of 9 years. But in my experience, people tend to serve about 6 years. And so, you know, impact conversations are long and slow. And we like to think we go from step 1 and we learn that, we move to step 2 and we build up to quite a nuanced, sophisticated level of understanding. But I think what that doesn't take into account is change of board members. And for us, we've had quite a lot of change. And particularly even in the last year, 60% of my 10 board members are with me less than 6 months on our board. So that just gives you an example of the level of change. And so I think the reality that I've come to is that actually the conversation is much more like this. It's much more like a wave than it is like climbing a mountain. And that maybe that's actually okay. Because, you know, there are pros and cons of turning over board members, but for us, it's actually important to keep our board fresh because we do raise money. And, you know, the public and our donors need to understand that our board members do change and that fresh people come in and ask fresh questions. So when people come in and ask fresh questions, sometimes they ask questions people have asked before. So that's just a reality. And I think it's a trade-off, actually, genuinely. It's a trade-off because there are wonderful things about having lots of change on your board, but then there are also challenges. And so my learning has been that building that conversation around governance of impact is something that needs to be continuous, and that will go up and down over time.
Thank you. And when you were saying the thing about climbing the mountain, I'm looking at the image that we have for the report, you know, of climbing a mountain. So maybe the mountain should be, you know, like that.
Maybe it needs to be a whirlpool instead.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask Briouk, because you have a board that is composed of people from different sectors, public, private, social, and you actually have, you're one of the foundation that is including you know, a diversity perspective quite well, you know, in terms of having lots of committees where a lot of different stakeholders are represented. So that on the one hand, you know, is quite a best practice example. But I also wanted to ask you then about your role, because you talked about now you're approaching the board about something. So obviously, like the role of the CEO is to stand in a way between the board and the rest of the organization. Also, what you work on upwards with the board and then downwards with the rest of the organization, and that is of course a challenge as well for the CEO. So do you want to explain anything about the role of the CEO in that sense, and how you're managing that?
Yeah, sure. So I think indeed the expectations are, of course, not always the same, whether you're at board level or whether you're in the staff or in the executive committee. Also, the years of experiences you may have, having tried different things, or coming in with a fresh view. All these things, of course, make that different people have different expectations. And I think one of my jobs and roles is to manage those expectations in terms of, at the same time, make sure that we don't promise things that would not only be extremely complex, but also may create a way too narrow view on the impact that we may have, and therefore also triggering pernicious effects as to the projects that we put forward. As you know, theory of change, and change is never very linear, and therefore, you know, pretending that it is and trying to come up with indicators that would falsely claim a certain impact, I think would be potentially damageable. And at the same time, of course, we have to be ambitious, and I think that's what we need to stimulate our colleagues in terms of showing what is possible, and in terms of being ambitious, and also in terms of looking to different sectors and actors as to how they look at impact. And I think one of the evolutions that is quite interesting for foundations like ours is a shift to more and more investments in private equity as to the endowments that some of us may manage. And the private equity sector, especially in terms of climate and biodiversity, has developed quite ambitious and interesting and sophisticated methodologies to measure and evaluate impact. And so it's that you know, dichotomy sometimes of managing expectations on the one hand, but also inspiring colleagues on the other hand. And one of the things we've done, but again, I think we're in the same sort of situation as with Deirdre and Wilfried here, is that we are making progress on all fronts. We have that dashboard that you briefly explained the design of, in terms of showing how well we are doing with regards to the enablers of the foundation to actually realize that impact. And I think that's what we need to do: show what's possible, and at the same time be humble in terms of what we will be able to achieve.
Yeah, thank you. And I sort of opened the discussion a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I mean, obviously, Leonora mentioned in her presentation that it was one of the things that came out as well as a challenge for many foundations is how to actually sort of integrate the voices of the stakeholders that the foundations are serving. And it's not always easy to do that at board level, perhaps, but I don't know if Deirdre, perhaps you could say something about how you're thinking about that topic, and also Briok, if you have any further comments about the committees that you have created as well at King Baudouin Foundation. Starting with Deirdre.
Yeah, delighted to, Lisa. Rethink Ireland was registered as a company 10 years ago, but really got operational about 7 years ago. So we've had directors, if you like, for 10 years. And our early board, certainly the first 5 years, was really focused on fundraising. Because if you don't raise any money, you can't make any impact. So governance of impact was really a later stage problem. And so as we have actually raised money, allocated it, and started to develop impact, we've had to focus much more on that side. And as a result, we have changed our board membership over time. And as part of that, we have certainly in the last 2 years been looking at how can we ensure that we have people on our board with lived experience of the issues that we're trying to tackle, whether they're equality issues, mental health issues, disability issues, marginalization, whatever that might be. So we have now got one person on our board, and we aim to add a second person. We've also added somebody with that profile to our grant making committee, so they make the decisions around the allocation of grants. And we have trialed involving a panel of young people in our youth grants. So it has become much more of a focus for us. And with, very good experiences, I have to say. However, what I would say is it's much harder work than it looks to find those people and persuade them to get involved, basically. And I think one of the particular challenges on boards is certainly in Ireland, as a registered charity, you're not allowed to pay your directors. So you're asking somebody with lived experience of poverty or marginalization to come and give lots of their time for free when they may not have a lot of other income. And that in itself is quite challenging, but it would be illegal to pay them. So even some of those basic regulatory dynamics make it a challenging situation.
Yeah, thank you. Briok, did you want to add something to that?
Well, I think it's important that we explicit our mission, as I said in the very beginning. I think foundations like ours play to their strengths when they try to complement public action and not replace it. And I think that message is very important for all stakeholders of foundations like ours. That's how I think we can maximize our impact, is to be that societal innovation laboratory. And I think that's a very important message to give, especially in our governance model, where decisions are very much centralized in thousands of committees and juries and whatnot, because we don't have any shareholders and we don't have any members either. So we need to make sure that all decisions are taken in a way that is aligned with our stakeholders and that represents that diversity and that expertise as well. So I would say important to clarify our mission. What is the role of philanthropy in a foundation like ours on the one hand, and then secondly, try to make sure that message is heard on all levels and in the many different governance bodies of the King Baudouin Foundation.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you, and I'll let you prepare a bit, as a final question, to give some advice to the audience, to other foundations in terms of how to improve the governance of impact. But before we go there, I also see that there's a question in the Q&A, and it's for Wilfried. And of course, if you have as well, any additional comment on the idea, on these ideas of stakeholder involvement, very, very happy to hear your advice there. But the question to you from the audience is that you described the impact thinking of people with an industry background as based on KPIs, investing and return, and how would you describe the impact thinking in a civil society environment? So if you could address that question.
Yes, let me try this. I think in the civil society, it's not a question, for example, of output and like how many cars do you produce and sell, and how much money do you get or gain out of this selling, and have some money for reinvesting in the company. It is in the civil society you have different problems, and the main thing is what do you really change in the life of people, for example, and how do you make sure that this is a real change, and it has nothing to do with output at that time. I mean, as I said, we counted how many brochures we have printed and how many books we have sold or spent to the different stakeholders, but this doesn't change anything. You have really to have outcome and impact on a different step, and this is very different to the private sector, and it is very different to describe this, by the way. You see it by myself. I mean, sometimes you need really examples to describe this, what's the main difference is, and it's the main question for a lot of board members we have is how do you measure this? And I always, well, not always, but I sometimes say it's very hard to measure because you can't measure. It takes so much money to measure and so much time that this money and this time is much bigger than the project itself to measure something in this area. And yeah, this is my answer to this question.
Yeah, it somehow it has to be proportionate, right? You cannot spend more on the measurement than on the actual initiative. I think that's a great point. Leonora, you're also now joined for the Q&A, but I suggested that we actually turn the question back now to our panelists in terms of a final advice. I think the other questions that are in the Q&A, there was one question about joining the community of practice. So this is an interesting one. I mean, we're now thinking what to do, and next steps for the community of practice. So we'll definitely keep everyone posted on the next steps, and if we're going to continue in the same format, and if new organizations can join. I think it has been a valuable experience for the ones that have been part of the community of practice. And the other one was about citing our paper, which of course, we're delighted, if you want to cite that. Leonora mentioned that the executive summary will be available on our website tomorrow, so you can download it. And feel free to then cite the paper. Leonora, anything else that?
No. I mean, just in case anyone from the audience had an additional question, but otherwise we'll just go ahead and I guess wrap up. So thank you.
Okay, so I'll just ask then as sort of to close this webinar, each of you to maybe just say a few words as of advice, to other foundations. I'll start with Rio. That's okay.
No, sure. My advice is very short. I think we need to integrate insights from all different types of sectors and be inspired by them. Academics, of course, which is why we were very happy to support this project, but also other sectors such as the financial sector, NGOs, and others. So I think I would open up as much as possible and be inspired by many different sources.
Okay, thank you. Deirdre, over to you.
So my advice would be have courage. And I'm speaking as a CEO. I'm supposed to be an expert on impact and governance of impact, but thinking about this question made me feel very scared. And so I have to say that participating in this research and having very real shared conversations with my colleagues here and others on the call actually gave me courage to go and raise the question of governance of impact with the board, which honestly, I don't think we'd ever in 10 years had a formal conversation about it. And what I would say is, I think there can be, the fear is driven by the sense of, you know, a lot of board members are interested in KPIs and measurements and data. And we know that takes us so far, but it doesn't take us all the way. And often it doesn't capture the most important impacts. And certainly I was afraid of that conversation. But if we can move the conversation into a joint conversation between management and boards, that's about approaching it with curiosity and making it a real human conversation where we're learning together. I think that can really shift the dynamic and open up potential for all kinds of things to happen in those conversations. And what I would say is that armed with this research, that's exactly what I'm going to do with my board. So I've been very much inspired to do it by participating in this research. And without this, I don't know if I would have had the courage. So that's why I mentioned courage. And I want to say thank you very much, Elisa, to you and your research team, but also to the funders of the research, because I think it's invaluable. And our board has now appointed a board member who's a former awardee to lead that conversation at the board. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, that's really wonderful to hear. And I think that you also mentioned this sort of tension that we have found as well in many other foundations between sort of accountability and learning. And I think, I mean, actually in our academic research that Valentin, who's a PhD student working on this project, you know, is working on with me. You know, we looked at, for example, how, you know, in some foundations, and this is typical that you think about the conversation with the board. It's about reporting to the board. Okay, this is what we have done, and you know, it's a bit like, okay, they should approve that you're doing well. You know, but if you actually are able to turn it into conversation, you know, where it's more a dialogue, and you know, that can actually become very interesting as well, you know, as a platform for the CEO as well to learn from the board, and it then, you know, feeding that information back into the foundation. You know, that's sort of those translation mechanisms that we discussed. So Wilfried, you have the final word.
Lisa, I would say the advice I would like to give is to analyze the situation the organization is in regarding impact measurement and governance of impact, because we found out that if you do the wrong thing at the right time, you don't have a chance to implement easily. Means I think it's very important that you don't just adapt some of the tools you might hear today or tomorrow. It's more important to see what you really need at what stage. That's what our experience is. We had a lot of failures during this long time of impact thinking, and it's always a question of how do you convince the people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those words of wisdom from the three of you. I wanted to really thank you for joining, to our panelists for joining. And if we were in a live session, we could now give you a round of applause. But I also wanted to thank everyone who has joined the webinar today. Thanks for your participation. And of course, thanks to the 6 foundations that joined us in this research journey, and as well to, of course, the 4 foundations that funded the project, Bertelsmann Stiftung, Carasso Foundation, Laudes Foundation, and the Baudouin Foundation. So thanks everyone for joining, and have a very nice rest of the afternoon. Bye-bye.